You're talking to the boss here.
Good, maybe someone will smack some goddamn sense into him.
What makes a word taboo?
Any taboo has to be rooted in culture. So there are certain things in our cultures that, we find problematic. Death is one of the most problematic things we've got. So it's not surprising that certain things related to death are going to be tabooed. Suicide might be one of them. If you look in obituaries, when somebody commits suicide, we generally avoid the word. Used to be apparently that cancer was similar, that if somebody died of cancer, you didn't say that, you said they died of natural causes, and everybody inferred from that you meant cancer. Sex, we have a lot of taboos around sex. We have a lot of taboos around, bathroom activities. Food is a very common cultural taboo. There's all sorts of cultures that have, certain foods that are forbidden and, certain practices around food that are forbidden. Money is a really big taboo in a lot of cultures. I don't know about you, where you come from, but, the way I was brought up, we don't talk about money. And I didn't even recognize that. I was living in Budapest right after I graduated from college. And I would go to parties, and like one of the first questions somebody would ask me when I was introduced was, "How much money do you make?" And I was like, "Wow, that's a terrible question." And I was like, I would dodge the question, and they would get annoyed with me and keep pushing. And so I said this to a friend. I'm like, "Why do they keep asking me this? It seems really rude." And my friend looks at me and goes, "Why does that bother you? That's a normal question." And I started talking to her, and she's like, "Yeah, no, money's not a big deal. It's kind of like asking college students what's your major. It's just a way of starting a conversation." And I was like, "Huh, okay, so that's clearly part of my culture. That's not part of your culture." But certainly we find that money in a lot of cultures is taboo.
Does it have anything to do with the words or the phrases around the word? Or is it just like, no, it's more about the culture surrounding that particular thing?
So there's some evidence, very weak evidence in my mind, that suggests that certain sounds are going to lend themselves to a swear word more than others. What linguists call stops, like ta, ka, pa, are more likely to be taboo words than other words. It's not perfect. Certainly you can find lots of counterexamples to it. So it's just a weak correlation. But there's some evidence to suggest that sounds may enter into it. That doesn't change what I would argue is the fact that it's still arbitrary. That there's nothing special about the sounds fuck that led to us making that word taboo.
Go San Diego.
Are language taboos usually associated with swear words? Or can you have a language taboo that has no bad words in it?
What I would say is that there are some really interesting ones where I can't point to any taboo words, but names, like naming practices rather, there's a lot of taboos around them, like who you can call what. So, can you refer to your can you address your teacher by their first name or not?
That's like, it's definitely when I was growing up. You referred to every adult by like sir or ma'am or their Mr. and their last name. And then with my sons, they will refer to people by their first names. And my name obviously is Nick. And like one of my son's friends called me Nick. And I kind of whipped around like, what? That's not, no.
Yeah.
I'm Mr. VinZant.
Going back to naming, one of my favorite examples is an Aboriginal language in Australia. A man cannot talk, period, to his mother-in-law and vice versa. So there's just a taboo about that relationship such that they can't talk. There's other rules about how, what words you can use with your brother-in-law or your father-in-law, but with your mother-in-law, you can't say anything.
How about some more beans, Mr. Taggart? I'd say you've had enough.
What would you say are the biggest language taboos?
I mean, the most obvious is anything related to the bathroom. So, for example, imagine sitting at a dinner party and you have to excuse yourself. and you say to your, guests, "Excuse me, I need to go squeeze some feces out of my colon." I mean, that's terrible, right? There's no taboo words there, but that's incredibly taboo.
Right. I don't want to
Right?
know.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, all of those categories are still taboo, even if you're not using the taboo words. You don't talk about sex with your mom, right? And it doesn't matter how much you use clinical terms while talking about it. It's just don't do it. There are taboo words derived from animals, but there are also rituals and rules about talking about certain animals. Not all animals are going to be tabooed. But in certain cultures, dogs are considered unclean. And so it wouldn't be surprising that certain discussions around dogs is also going to be considered unclean. There's a lot of word magic that we find in culture after culture. As much as we might think that we're kind of above that, those superstitions, we're all prone to them. And so, talking about defecating, it's unclean, the actual act. And so, in a sense, we're soiling ourselves just by talking about it.
I am not what I would consider to be a prude in pretty much any way, but I don't want to hear about that. Like I don't want to know. What are some of the other big language taboos?
Religion, I mean, even just talking about religion can be highly taboo, and there's that kind of advice that you're given. Don't talk about religion. You don't talk about politics with people you don't know. So there's a lot of these things that are perhaps fraught that we don't talk about. I mean, I think every time I get in a conversation with somebody and politics come out, or we start talking about politics, there's always that moment where you're kind of navigating, what can I say in front of this person and what can't I say?
Are you like me or are you not like me? Right?
Yes.
Do you have the same opinions that I do? Are there any language taboos that have become more acceptable to talk about? Like, oh, you didn't used to talk about this at all.
The one I can think of is menstruation. I think there's been a concerted effort to take some of the taboo away from that. I recall when I was young, you did not see ads for tampons on TV. You did not see ads for tampons in magazines. That was just not acceptable. And I think, more and more people are comfortable talking about menstruation. I think anything related to homosexuality, we've certainly opened that up. I look back at Lenny Bruce, who was thrown in jail for saying the word cocksucker. You wouldn't get that today.
Is there a pushback against those kind of things?
Absolutely. I mean, we can look back to the 20th century of people trying to normalize sex words. So, there was all sorts of censorship you see on the word fuck. So, for example, who's the author of The Naked and the Dead? Norman Mailer. He wasn't allowed to say fuck in his novel about World War II. So, there's all these graphic scenes of people dying and stuff. And, not surprisingly, soldiers swore. We all know that. But in the novel, he couldn't write the word fuck. And so his editors forced him to write fug everywhere that he would have written fuck. I think back on the word Catholic. That was a euphemism. That was it was an invented word because the earlier word for a Catholic was papist. That came from Pope. And that was just a normal word until Anglicans started using it so often as a derogatory term that Catholics couldn't call themselves papists. And so they had to find a new word. You mentioned that you don't consider yourself a prude. And, I was teaching this course and I thought, well, I'm immune to it. Nobody's going to find a way to really offend me at this point. And then I was, like doing some work in my backyard, and I heard these kids out in the alley, and one of them was talking smack to the other, and this was just a few years after 9/11. And he said, "I'm going to take you down like the Twin Towers." And I was like, holy crap.
Wow. Like,
that is awful. And I was so mad. And I'm finding myself just like, ah. And I was like, okay. He found a way to push my button. So, yeah, I mean, you're going to find a way.
are you ready for some harder / listener submitted questions about taboos?
Absolutely.
I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls.
Biggest historical language taboos?
Oaths. I think that's probably the one I can think of the most, is if you go back in, like Old English, that some of the worst taboos you could have is giving your word on something insincerely. And that was the highest taboo, because at that time, there was no way of holding people accountable. There wasn't a court system. There wasn't any of that. And so all you had was your word, your honor. And if you didn't take that seriously, that was bad. That was a really bad thing. We don't have that today. We don't have words that have that much strength to them that people understand. You wouldn't say that unless you really, really meant it. Even things like "I swear by my mother's grave" doesn't have the power that it once had.
Are there any other ones that you would say have changed like that?
I mean, certainly if you look in, developed countries especially, but I think in most cultures, animal taboos are really not that strong anymore. You find a few here and there. Some of them are probably more religious oriented. Excuse me. So, for example, in Spanish, you've got a number of porco expressions, porco dio, porco modaña. So basically, pig. You put pig in front of these religious words, and it makes them worse. But I think historically, animal taboos were stronger if we go back in time. Words for wolf, words for bear have been lost to history because they were so bad that the euphemisms replaced them.
Are there any language taboos that you see coming?
I always have to preface this by saying that linguistics is not a predictive science, but I would guess, just judging by my children, I think there's some naming taboos that are in the works, and I don't know how they're going to manifest, but the taboos around dead naming are so visceral to my children that there's got to be some way that language is going to milk that emotion from them. And you see that to an extent that, as a way of really insulting somebody, like somebody who's, say, transgender, using their dead name as a way of really triggering them. So I would think that we're probably gonna get more taboos related to naming. Names have always been somewhat fraught in the sense that, who can say what name is culturally relevant. We talked about that a little bit with address forms, but there are languages, for example, where you can't say the names of ancestors who've died. So you have to find a way, like if you've got a child that was named after a relative and that relative dies, you have to change that child's name. So it's not that this is unprecedented, but I think it's manifesting itself in a different way than it has before. So to me, that's the one thing I see on the horizon, is that the way that children today, or I guess they're not even children anymore, but Gen Z is so attached to naming and how names are given and used. I kind of see something in the works there.